So welcome everyone to the evaluation and reporting for the Tribal Civil and Criminal Legal Assistance Technical and Training Assistance webinar. My name is Johanna Farmer and I am a program attorney with the National American Indian Court Judges Association.
And I'm Mary Rodriguez, program attorney with NIJA as well.
So if you don't know, NIJA, or the National American Court Indian Judges Association, is a national association comprised of tribal justice personnel and others devoted to supporting and strengthening tribal justice systems through education, information sharing, and advocacy. We do a lot of things around building up justice systems, ensuring that there's quality and culturally appropriate tribal judicial education available, as well as providing information about cooperation and collaboration among stakeholders in the tribal judicial system. As I mentioned, this webinar is being brought to you by the Tribal Civil and Criminal Legal Assistance Grant. This is just the grant disclaimer slide. So we'll today be going over the basics of an evaluation and then talk about methods to improve reporting and evaluation through a few different methods, and we'll go into each one and provide some examples for you all. So what is evaluation? So evaluation is anything and everything. It's a simple way to show your success in the ways that works best for your program. So it's a way to track what's working, what's not working. It's also a method to help make improvements to your program. So what's going on? How can we do better? So who evaluates? So evaluation is a powerful tool that anyone can use. So across each of your legal services organization, each one of you are kind of mini evaluators. It doesn't require a specialist or cost $1 million. Every program does basic evaluations and can do basic evaluations to make your program stronger. So these are examples of people that can do evaluation. Your attorneys that work in your office, program directors and staff, volunteers, your clients and partners help contribute to evaluation, community members, interns can all help evaluate your program. So why do we want to do evaluation besides the basic, I have a grant and this is required for me to evaluate the program? Evaluation is also a way to show the success of what's going on in your program. It offers a look at the breadth and depth of the work that you're doing. It can show what is successful. It can say, here are some things maybe we're struggling with and that we could improve on. Secure funding and to get more funding. Data is not a bad word. So when we talk about data, it can be scary. So let's change the language a little bit. Data can be anything you want. Stories. So stories are a really great form of data collection. So starting with, remember that time when, that's data. So when you're talking about maybe a client, it's like, okay, the client came in the door and these were the needs that they had. That's a story. When they left, here was the outcome of their case. Here what was successful. Here were the challenges we experienced. Here are the services we connected that client to. All of those are data points throughout that whole story you're telling. Memories. So think about what you ate today. That's data. Daily occurrences. How many people drank coffee this morning? That's a data resource. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but Indigenous people have always been great storytellers. And, sometimes when we think of data, we just think of the numbers, the quantitative things, but there's also the qualitative things, the kind of storytelling. So when we expand what we think of data, it really can give us a better picture of what's going on in our programs. Data is powerful. Fortunately or unfortunately, one of the things that's really important, especially when it comes to federal funding, is showing the success of what your program is. And but more importantly, data tells the story of what your program is doing, the people are in it, and why the work you're doing is so important. So, like I said, it doesn't have to be numbers, it can be something easy to understand. And then we'll talk a little later about using your data to help strengthen things that are going on in your program or to explain to others what's going on in your program. So, how do you evaluate? So, there's no right way to collect and process data. You have to find a way that works best for you and your program. Be open to improving data collection. Evaluation can make it easier for those reporting requirements for the TCCLA grant more easy and more sustainable. So, when we talk about how to evaluate, you all have case management systems that maybe collect some of the data that you need. What other things can you use to evaluate? And maybe it's just a spreadsheet that you're using to evaluate. You're inputting data into that numbers, maybe, or we'll talk later about maybe you're collecting newsletters to that has stories in it. So TCLA FY23 does have certain data that's required to be collected, and we'll go through each one of the questions that's asked in the TCLA reporting to help you to develop better narratives for some of those questions that are being asked in the grant reporting. So these are the methods of improving data collection, evaluation, and reporting, and we'll go into each one of them.
The first method we'll discuss is narrative storytelling. And so that semi-annual grant report does have 9 questions. And some of the 9 questions maybe don't do the best job at capturing what you are doing in this full year cycle. So you do report twice a year. And um, the BJA has specifically asked the TA providers to help encourage and improve some of the data that's collected in those semi-annual grant reportings. So one of the methods we've talked about is narrative storytelling. Messaging along with stories is much more powerful and memorable than just talking points and data. So the way narrative storytelling can work, as Johanna said, it is a way that Indigenous people have been telling their stories through time immemorial. It is a way that personalizes your data. And I think it's not traditionally seen as like the numbers science data. It can be as powerful as the number science data. And the way the questions in the semi-annual grant report are phrased invites narrative storytelling. I don't know if, as Johanna was saying, the tradition, the oral tradition of storytelling has been a powerful way to share stories since before colonization. If you're working in tribal communities, then the folks you're working with might be the most comfortable with narrative storytelling. They may be more likely to share their story to you because it's something that they were passed on as they grew up. And it's something they're more comfortable with in terms of talking about what has happened to them, talking about their memories, talking about potentially their cases. Using storytelling can be a tool for learning. It can show folks how something should be working. It can help make people feel powerful in terms of your story is important, your voice is important, and that's a source of strength for Indigenous communities. Um, in telling stories, it can help illustrate sort of an injustice that might have taken place where there is a call to action. So, in terms of the work that you're doing, it can highlight maybe an injustice that was done that the legal services program helped figure out. It can help persuade others who are in power to really start to think about some of these issues that come up in representation of clients. It can also help your clients understand information. So if you have a story of a domestic violence situation and you tell somebody who has come in with a new domestic violence case, you're able to say, here's a story. Let me tell you about what happened in this case, which might make them feel more comfortable, which might make them feel more trusting of the process and understanding of what it is as your role as an attorney and what you'll be helping them with. Um, Sharing your truth is very important. I know when I would touch back with clients after I represented them to sort of get their story, there was a sense of pride in that. Hey, not only did I get to know this person as a client, but I value their opinion. I want to know, their side of the story. I want to know how things turned out on their end. Getting the voices of people with criminal records out there can combat the stereotype and correct the record, because I think a lot of some of the news stories and the headlines out there are that all criminals are bad people and they have nothing to give to the world. And so when you are dealing with clients in criminal situations, you're able to get their voice out there, their story. You're able to humanize that person. Making sure your organization has the same goals. So making sure everybody who might be gathering stories from clients or taking down stories and recording them from clients, making sure everyone understands these goals, like sharing fluency, making sure everybody knows the words that are going to be used, that people are on the same page, making sure the storytelling is inclusive. Are you making sure everyone's voice is heard from different perspectives? And then shared values. Knowing that and sharing this with the people you're interviewing, that the value of these storytelling is like, we want to educate. Two, this helps with our reporting. Three, we're here to share your voice and make you feel powerful. And making sure that you're saying, disclosing, this isn't to just get out your story as like a sob story. We're here to actually help collect data that's going to improve legal services and improve the ways we interact with the community. Questions to ask when you are, gathering these stories is the story told respectfully? Again, looking at your goals, making sure they're partnered with them. And is this an authentic story? Making sure you center the storyteller's perspective, which means you may need to give some background information. If the audience is not familiar with maybe where you're practicing, you may need to let them know, like, this person is from a rural tribal community, or this person is, a victim of a crime and has experienced PTSD, and that's the place that they're coming from when they tell you this story. Using plain, accessible language, making sure your audience is going to understand your story. Sometimes we get trapped in legalese, and we tend to elaborate and enhance our storytelling in a way that maybe isn't the most authentic to the audience that we're trying to present it to. You also want to ask yourself, can this storytelling continue? Is there a point in time where you can check in with this person in 6 months and ask how are they doing? How is the progress going? If the story is that they went through a program in the legal services organization and they became employed, check back on them in 6 months. Are they still employed? Not only if even if the story ends to where it's not the data point that you wanted, so maybe they lost their job, you're getting stories and you're getting data and you are getting their understanding of what happened that maybe is the reason why they lost their job. If it's like contact again with the criminal justice system, then maybe there's an entry point there that you may want to work on in your legal organization as well. One important part about narrative storytelling is confidentiality. You always want to obtain the storyteller's informed consent. And, depending on where you're practicing, there may be the need for a written consent form. Make sure that written consent form is straightforward, understandable to the client, and make sure your client is truly consenting to share their story, that they don't feel coerced or pressured. After, say, your client, you were in a very difficult, dramatic, stressful case, and the outcome was really wonderful for your client, they may just need some time. They might not be ready to share that story. They might need some time to take a breath, relax, refresh, making sure that you aren't asking people who feel pressured to tell their story. Protect their privacy, avoid identifying information, making sure you aren't using their names or their identifiers or even tribal affiliation, because sometimes that can narrow down, if it's a small tribe, narrow it down pretty quickly to who the story might be about. If you're sharing with people outside of your organization, maybe just using the first name is a great idea, or a made up first name, so that if there's ever some, legal problems down the road, this story isn't going to be connected with them. That might be used against them in any other type of proceeding or hearing or anything like that. So just always keeping that in the back of your mind, that their privacy is very important. Protecting your legal work. Make sure that you're evaluating this picture for your client and keeping their best interests in mind. Like I said, making sure that, is your desire to tell this story, is it competing with the best interest of your client? If your case is active, that's going to require special consideration. Obviously, there will be ethical obligations. It's probably a best practice to tell stories after the case is closed. But there may be some, ability to tell a client story while it's ongoing or while they haven't finished a program or something along those lines. But do make sure you're paying attention to those ethical obligations. Here we have a narrative story example. So this was taken from Michigan Indian Legal Services. They do have a newsletter that goes out in the fall. And here is a story about a person that went through services through Michigan Indian Legal Services. This is definitely written in like a newsletter form. So there are some really great, adjectives like buoyed by newfound alleys. Like some of these are really great words. The BJA would love to see things like this when they are asking for examples of success stories. They are actually looking for like an article that they can share with their constituents that show like, hey, look at this client who went through and, was resilient in the face of adversity. They finished all the programs that they were supposed to. And, Michigan Indian Legal Services helped them get to that point. Like what a valuable service this is. Again, as reporting is required, we also want to show off all the work that you are doing. We also want to show off why it's important to keep funding the TCCLA grant and to keep funding legal services and public defense in tribal communities. Johanna, you want to do utilizing AI?
Yeah. So, utilizing artificial intelligence. Part of what we can do as a method for collecting this, and part of why it's beneficial, is the speed and efficiency. AI processing speeds are far beyond human capabilities, and the technology is available 24/7. Also, continuous improvement. So, artificial intelligence is constantly improving based on the information that you're inputting it. It learns your style and improves upon the tasks it's been asked. And then time saving. So it mitigates some of the reporting challenges. Resources can be allocated to other value adding activities. So it's able to maybe flesh out narrative. So maybe I have some of a narrative, but I need more of a narrative, or I want it to be more expansive than it is. I could put in what I have and it could kind of expand on that. Here is an example. So Mary had put in to AI, here are some case notes that I have, and please like make this into a narrative storytelling. So if we, I think, look at the next slide, Mary. Yep. So this is a chat GPT prompt summarizing the case notes below to tell this success story. So those case notes then were put in, and then it gives us this narrative version of what the case notes are. So it saves that time. We already have the case notes available to us. It's just fleshing out this narrative.
And
Next
I
slide.
think too, with this, just a comment that I know sometimes the grant reporting might just fall on one person in the organization, but there might be multiple attorneys working on cases. So this is a good one where you could direct a attorney to say, hey, can you copy and paste those notes from that case file of a case that went really well, that shows like all of the services that were provided and all of the connections and relationships that were established for this person. If you could just, put that in Chat GPT, obviously there are some things you need to review. You need to make sure the words make sense. You need to make sure it's actually true. But it does, like Johanna was saying, can, mitigate some of the time that's spent on reporting. That's not just falling on maybe the one person who's given a crushing amount of data and is like, oh, I need to synthesize all of this and put it into something that, the BJA is going to want to see.
And then I think before we move to spreadsheets, we do want to say, there are obviously some limitations on Chat GPT or using AI. You have to be very careful about confidentiality, so not putting information into, AI generators that's confidential. And like Mary said, reading through it once you've put it in there, making sure it's like factual information, because there have been, those, I'm sure you've all heard by now, some of those ethical cases where, attorneys used it and the AI generated fake cases to support the argument. And then the attorney doubled down that those were actual cases. So we just, have to be very wary of those. There is limitations to Chat GPT or AI, but there are ways to utilize it that increase our proficiency and speed of grant narrative reporting.
The next method we talk about is spreadsheets. This is just a way you can organize data and collaborate spreadsheets between folks in your organization. They can be shareable across the organization. They could be imported into other documents, which make it useful. And they can be created from case management software. I know a lot of folks use similar case management software, but it does create a place, data resource spot where multiple people could be accessing it and sharing it. This is an example of the TTA, which is Training and Technical Assistance Request. So on NIJA's website, we do, or just by email, folks will email and say, hey, we need some help with, establishing this tribal court, or redoing our tribal code. So I just created down here, we have the tabs of the folks that requested the TTA, and then I just have very simply like 5 columns. And this is where everybody in our organization can go and say, okay, we have the date of a request. We can write down who it's about, any information or like reply emails. We can also summarize that and put that in here. But it's a great way for everybody to have one central place where we're putting all of that information, so that when I go back for our semi-annual grant report, I can see like, oh, we have 8 new tabs at the bottom. We had 8 TA requests. Here's a summary of the TA that was provided. You could even copy some of that summary, put it in Chat GPT and say like, hey, can you make this more of like a narrative about all of these, 5 emails that were sent back and forth, what was accomplished.
And when I worked for a grant program, and we wanted to look at how are we improving things. So we were tracking a lot of dates. So for example, like when did the police receive the citation? And then when did they refer the citation over to the prosecutor's office? And then from the prosecutor's office, how long did it take for them to, get a hold of the family? And it was a truancy diversion program. So we're tracking how many days did the student miss before the school referred them over? Then how many days they missed between the time the police received the citation and the family had an intervention. And one of the good things about spreadsheets is we could put in the dates and then they were auto calculating. So we could see, okay, it's taking 19 days. And so that's one of the things we wanted to improve, was those 19 days. But if we weren't tracking those dates, then we wouldn't have known that we needed that improvement of the amount of time. So those are the good things about spreadsheets, is it auto calculates some of this stuff for us. So integrating existing data reporting. So you already are doing some data collection already. You may already have it prepared, or even it's written. Utilizing existing data resources. So if you have teams, check-ins, newsletters, Maybe you're reporting for other grants that you can utilize. We talked about not just other reporting, like grant reporting to other people, your case management systems. Every meeting or check-in, you could ask the reporting question. So prep staff to have answers ready, take notes. And like Mary had mentioned, we'll go over the questions during this webinar. So you kind of have an idea of what it is that we are looking for grant reporting. And again, do you have an existing newsletter that you can use? And then what other reporting for funding streams or grants already exist or are required for you? And so how can you utilize that data for TCCLA reporting? So one example is Alaska Legal Services Corporation emails a monthly newsletter where they have stories that are written or data that can be used. This is an example of their newsletter from January and from March. And so it has, stories in it and it has events and things that they're already doing. So all they have to do is pull the information from these existing newsletters to add into their TCCLA reporting.
So one of the questions we'll ask, what are your grant accomplishments? And if you find yourself at the end of the year being like, oh my gosh, I have no idea, Alaska Legal Services Corp could look back at their newsletters and at least get kind of a synopsis of some of the events that they've done, and some of the news that has been in the news about what they've been accomplishing. So they can start there if they needed like a little nudge in the right direction. One method we'll discuss is surveys and polls. You can use these to collect data. They can be internal. One way is you could actually even use the TCCLA semi-annual grant report questions in your surveys and polls. I know getting folks to answer surveys and polls can be a bit of a struggle, but it could be part of like your client-based one. So if you have a satisfaction survey, you could add in a couple of the reporting questions that maybe you struggle with, right? So if one is like, what could the BJA do to support you in meeting your grant accomplishments? That's kind of a question that's saying like, oh, for the things that you didn't get to do, what would be helpful, right? So you could include something in your satisfaction survey that's like, client, what did we not get to help you with that you would have appreciated or something? And maybe there's that you can add that into your semi-annual grant reporting is like, we wish we had the funding for helping clients connect with, transportation, something along those lines. An example of this would be like internal. So the semi-annual grant question number 3 is, what problems, barriers did you encounter that prevented you from reaching it? So that may be something that you discuss with your employees, your staff, that's like, hey, what happened this last 6 months? I mean, this is something you could also ask every month, right? Or every time you have a meeting, that's like, what happened that prevented you from doing what you wanted to do, prevented you from making these goals, prevented you from providing the legal aid that you wanted to provide. And I'm sure that folks will come up with something, just because when you are practicing those barriers and those problems, it feels like sometimes they're 50% of your job, right? It's just encountering those barriers and problems and problem solving, finding a solution around them, right? Like I had such a hard time getting a hold of my client. They ran out of minutes, right? So, maybe that is something in reporting that could say like, hey, we're just having a problem with communication. Our clients do not have, cell phones. They don't have minutes for their cell phones. The cost of operating a cell phone has gotten so expensive, or maybe there's just no service where they are. As an external question, number 9 is saying, as a TCCLA grantee, are there collaboration efforts occurring between you and the Indian tribe, specifically the tribal public defender, and any other entity in your service area? If so, please describe these efforts. If not, please explain. This is an interesting question, number 9. A lot of folks are like, I'm not even sure why this is being asked. But this might be an external poll that you send out to local tribes that's saying like, hey, we're asked this every 6 months. We're really not sure what you guys are, if you have a public defender, if you're wanting a public defender, it might be a way to start a conversation with the local tribes that are in your area. It can also be any other entity. So maybe this is going out to service providers or other partners that you have that are working in with the same clients or who are working in the same communities. Again, some of these questions are a little confusing, right? And so we're trying to think of ways that you might be able to bring answers into number 9 that historically you've been like, I'm not 100% sure what this is asking or how to answer this question.
Recordings is another method. So voice notes. So recording something on your phone as a voice note or on your computer as a voice note. Zoom recordings of meetings that you're having with partners, or internally with your staff. We're having a staff meeting, and maybe part of your staff meeting is a training. And so that's a data point that you can collect, and you can go back and see, okay, this is how many Zoom meetings we had. So those recordings you could go back and pull from. Webinars and podcasts are also recordings that you can utilize to collect data. Read AI is available in Zoom. So that's like, it'll take notes for you. Otter AI is pretty much the same. So if you're doing Zoom recordings and you have these notes that are already there available for you, you can attend webinars about data. So keeping track of the number of webinars that are either you're giving to others or your staff is attending, keeping track of those. And maybe that's, each individual staff member is keeping track of the webinars that they're attending. And podcasts is either, staff getting educated and, attending podcasts to gain information. Or could you use recordings that you have of trainings that you're conducting internally that could be used to make into a podcast? So the following are the actual semi-annual grant reporting questions. So these are the TCCLA reporting questions that each one of the NAILS organizations have to answer semi-annually.
So we'll share an example of the answer that demonstrates a quality response and tips on how to bulk up your answers for the next semi-annual grant report. The next one is due January 30th, I believe, for the next pay period. Or not pay period, sorry, reporting period. So the first one, what were your accomplishments within this reporting period? Accomplishments can include classic data like cases, number of clients, creative data, resolutions, alternative to jail, narrative storytelling, success stories, training. I think a lot of times training is kind of skipped over as something that's an accomplishment, but the BJA does like to see that you held a webinar for attorneys in your office or the state of New Mexico for people on veterans rights or something like that. Hiring and recruitment, that takes a lot of energy. Recruitment is a big one right now. Keeping your attorneys, keeping your staff, doing things that promote wellness and health and happiness in your office is important, and making sure that you're taking note of that, like to encourage and to keep our office happy and safe and healthy. We've been doing A, B, and C. Those are important as well. Partnerships and connections. This is one that I just really explored recently with data collection because it's not necessarily seen as like a traditional measurement, but a lot of the things that you're doing are, establishing and maintaining these partnerships and connections with lots of different organizations. Sometimes every single tribal department, right? Like there's a lot of turnover on both sides of the field, right? In the tribe, there's turnover at the legal services organizations, but making sure that, like, say you have an established a relationship with somebody in the housing department, that, maintaining that relationship, making sure that you're having regular check-ins via email, all of that is a data point that can be collected. System improvement. So have you worked on, what have you installed at the office recently? It's a new software. Is it, some sort of program for attorneys? Is it, you know, uh, some sort of like reimbursement program for work clothes, whatever it is, making sure that you are sharing those accomplishments. I think a lot of times the traditional data is just like, we've had 5 cases in this court, and the people serve 6 months in jail, right? But that doesn't really show the BJA, like the actual work that was done in those 6 cases, and why it's important that this funding should stick around, and why the work that you do is so important. And I think now more than ever, that's one thing that I think all of us should try and emphasize, is that this work is, it's important, and it's, not a political issue. It's across, everybody needs civil legal aid, everybody needs public defense, everybody needs these services, regardless of political affiliation or what's going on in politics. The example we have is from Anishinaabe Legal Services, their accomplishments. Oh, and one thing in terms of accomplishments, actually, well, their accomplishments were like, they talked about representing defendants in the dual jurisdiction DWI Healing to Wellness Court they had. It is okay if you've already reported on this to again report, like, what is the DWI Healing to Wellness Court? Because this report's going out to many different people that may not be familiar with what you wrote 6 months ago. So it's totally fine to be like, here's where it's at. This is what it is involved. This is why it's important. And you repeat that in 6 months from now. Maybe you change and you add a success story from a client that's going through. But again, like making sure that you are promoting the good work that you're doing. This answer also has, there's 18 clients that were served during this reporting period, and lists some of the things that were successful when representing those clients. Preventing incarceration, contesting sanction recommendations, preventing probation, discharges, that sort of thing. And then involvement. So this is when we were talking about like your relationship. So are your attorneys, are they required to be at some of these like healing to wellness meetings? Are they required to be at, this legal service provider check-in meeting? Are they, what types of things are they doing for their clients, for the organization, and making sure you include those in your accomplishments?
2 is what goals were accomplished as they relate to your grant application. Um, think of this question as asking about your organization's goals for the TCCLA grant. So usually it's increased civil or criminal representation. If you're unsure of what your goals are, we think it's important that that be shared. What the goals of your TCCLA program is. And can you figure out your goals from how you define what your accomplishments were in question 1?
Yeah, if you're unsure what your goals are, check out how you've answered question 1, and you can easily find some goals there of like, oh, providing representation, making sure that our clients get the best fair outcome in their cases, and that we're a strong advocate. I'm sure that you have it somewhere written down somewhere, but that's just an easy way if people are struggling to figure out what their goals are.
Yeah, because the TCCLA grant in general is just that increased civil representation for tribal clients, that increased public defense, criminal defense, criminal assistance.
Yeah, and some folks I think were confused because they were like, is it our organization's goals or is it like the TCLA goals? So it's okay to be your goals, and your goals match the TCLA goals, which is what Johanna just said. But if you, want to use your goals, that's fine as well.
So this is an example from Montana Legal Services about a good answer for what goals were accomplished. And so they talk about the primary goal is expanding access to justice for tribal members and promoting sovereignty, integrity of tribal courts. And then they go about explaining how they did that over the semi-annual reporting period.
And MLSA is given permission that if you're unsure of your goal, you can use that goal in the first sentence as your own goal as well. The third question, we sort of touched on this, but the problems, barriers you encountered, and the what if those prevented you from reaching your goals or milestones. So some of the questions you can ask yourself are, were you prevented from reaching any goals, accomplishments, hindered from reaching goals, accomplishments? Some of those hindrances and barriers are definitely going to be, these 5 here. Were there issues with recruitment and retention? Were there issues with access to justice and services? Issues with funding and resource constraints, evaluation and reporting? Maybe these aren't the best questions, or there's a better way to maybe do this that you can put in there that says like, hey, I don't really get question 8 and what it has to do with, the TCCLA grant. Technical issues, right? Like, is Wi-Fi a problem? Is your broadband a problem? Is the fact that like your clients live on a reservation with no access to the internet a problem? All of these are a way to highlight that we still need the funding. We still have so much work to do, that these problems are consistently a problem, and that legal services is still doing a great job in spite of some of these issues. And I think sometimes it's hard because like you don't want to complain because you are getting a funding source, but these 5, even if you just listed as a subject matter, these 5, that's a problem for everybody, right? Those are the barriers and problems that we are overcoming to try and do our jobs here. So here's one example of staffing. So this one was talking about, we experience like unexpected staffing shortages. In this case, it was illness, gaps in services, and sort of the snowball effect of not having enough staff, and basically how it made it difficult to accomplish some of their problems. One thing that is a problem in a lot of our organizations is like there's just a lack of attorneys that want to do public service work. So, you lose an attorney who goes on to do something else, and there's not another attorney to replace them, right? So taking something like this, that's going to be an issue in most legal services organizations, and just like expanding on it, right? I don't think you're complaining in a way that says I'm undeserving of future funding, but noting that like we have a shortage of attorneys who want to do this work. And we really are trying to come up with ways to problem solve, but it's a problem across the board.
4 is there any assistance that BJA can provide to address any problems or barriers identified in question 3 above? So here are some examples of things like you can address exactly the things that we talked about in question 3. So what kind of support could they provide? Definitely funding, additional funding for what? For staff to meet wage gaps, for training for staff, um, more money for client specific services. If we could be able to provide them with bus passes, that might be able to address the transportation issue. So using this question to kind of tell the BJA, these are the things that the federal government could provide to us as direct service providers to help support the problems and barriers we're facing. So here is an example of, there's limited access to legal assistance by low-income individuals appearing in tribal courts. Our program provides as much support as possible, but in order to address the varied needs, more funding and resources is needed to support them. Base funding for civil and criminal assistance would be helpful to our organization and would help with sustainability. As we all know, grants are, competitive. They are not guaranteed. And so when we get base funding, that means that it's just guaranteed to the organizations. And that's the kind of push that we're making for funding.
Question 5 is, are you on track fiscally and programmatically? To complete your program as outlined in your grant application, this is a yes or no question. If you say yes, you don't need an explanation. If you say no, some reasons why you might say no are impossibility, impracticability, explaining those, like here's an example of, New Mexico legal aid saying like, no, we've been limited because we don't have enough staff. Or we have one legal aid organization who the tribe that they're supposed to provide representation for has like gone through no prosecutor, and then it takes 4 months to hire a prosecutor, and then the judge leaves, so then they don't have a judge. So like a year of them not being able to do it, which is like impossibility or impracticability, and just basically explaining those reasons why. That's a great answer.
Question 6 is what major activities are planned for the next 6 months? So specific activities versus general activities. So representation, do you have any clinics, any in-person events? And then you can think back to your previous accomplishments for the ideas about what major activities are planned for the next 6 months. So some examples are, civil legal representation in court. So that's like a specific activity that's being done. Providing a drop-in legal clinic to the tribe, establishing a partnership with a service provider. So what are the next 6 months? And then another thing we, besides looking at what your accomplishments were for question 1, is also looking at your past reports. What have you done in the past that you'd like to, maybe do this next 6 months around?
And the good thing is, number 6, you can kind of build up this as you go. Like if you have 20 bullet points, that's great. And then when you look back at the next semi-annual grant reporting, you're like, oh, here's my 20 bullet points. So I actually have all of these accomplished because that's what we did for 6 months. And it just makes your reporting hopefully easier, right? That's the goal, at least, to make it easier.
Yeah. And then, like Mary said, you can say, okay, these are the ones that we accomplished. So maybe we're able to accomplish 15 and we didn't accomplish 5, and we can identify what problem or barrier did we have for accomplishing those other 5. And then we have an answer for one of the other questions for grant reporting.
So number 7 is an interesting question based on your knowledge of the criminal justice system. Are there any innovative programs, accomplishments that you would like to share with the BJA? Again, a question I'm not quite sure what the criminal justice portion has to do with, since a lot of us are also doing civil legal aid. Ideas for this is innovation. This is where you can brag about like the cool things you are doing. What makes tribal court practice unique, creative, what makes it kind of one of its kind, right? Asking your partners for this. Do they have any knowledge, or like what are they doing in the community that's awesome that needs to be shared? This is a time for you to brag about your clients, your partners, your tribal courts, and highlight the great work you're doing. Even if you don't think it's innovative, share it, right? Like the fact that it's in this community, the fact that, this relationship between our legal service organizations going into tribal communities and providing help is innovative on its own. However you do that, because you are doing great work in access to justice, showing up in places that there are legal deserts where no one is providing help is innovative. It's okay to repeat what you've written in your accomplishments and your activities as an answer here. I think this is a question that I think the BJA likes to see, like, oh, there's like cool things that are always happening. So it's okay if your cool things are yourself, because you are doing a great job. Example of this is, some of the things that we've been seeing in legal aid organizations are the Pro Se Client Resource Manual and the corresponding bench book, something NLS has been working on. MLSA has Tribal Advocacy Incubator Program. ALSC is one that's doing community justice workers. So just like it could be a topic of one of the projects that you're working on that you can expand on and talk about. But all of these are innovative, all of these are creative, all of these are things that not a lot of other places are doing, and not doing in a way that you are in tribal communities.
8 is please explain the status of enhanced sentencing authority in the tribes being provided with services. So again, this is another kind of strange question in the TCCLA grant reporting. But to your knowledge, are there any tribes where services are being provided to implement the enhanced sentencing authority under the Tribal Law and Order Act? And then what are any tribal clients affected by the enhanced sentencing authority that a tribe is practicing? So these are, some examples of answers. Nevada Legal Services, none of the tribes they work with have TLOA or VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act jurisdiction or enhanced sentencing authority. New Mexico Legal Aid during that reporting period puts, the Pueblo of Zuni was recently granted this, and then Oklahoma Indian Legal Services talks about some of the difficulties in implementing enhanced sentencing.
9, as a TCO grantee, are there collaboration efforts between you and the Indian tribe, specifically tribal public defender and any other entity in your service? If so, please describe these efforts. So this is another interesting question. Basically, what is a good answer, or you can refer to, as referrals from or to service providers, tribal departments, public defenders, meetings with stakeholders, projects with partners. Because I believe that this question is kind of getting at sort of the previous one, which is like TLOA and VAWA. If you are, or any of your attorneys are part of discussions about, establishing VAWA in a tribal community, or how to defend VAWA cases, you can include that. Intertribal working group, if anybody's attending those, that's kind of what it's getting at. Again, maybe not the best question for the purposes of what you do and what services you're providing, but it could be a way to highlight that, like, if a tribe is going to, do TLOA or do VAWA, we are ready, or we are there, or we are supportive, or we've been engaged, or we've been participating in some of these discussions. DNA has a good answer here where they basically talk about some of their collaborations that they have with different tribal courts and different jurisdictions, as well as like the law library, the law school, sort of talking about how, even though it's like, here's all the relationships we have, here's all the collaborations we're doing. I'm not quite sure why it's worded in this way, but it's a good way to highlight that, like, you're working in all of these capacities with different partners. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. We did record this session, so I will send it. It will actually be in the Teams group, the NAILS Teams group. It's actually already in the NAILS Teams group. If you are a part of that, I will also send it out again in a follow-up with an evaluation. The evaluation is great. It's helps us, make sure we're providing great TTA to everybody, and can help us improve in terms of that. As you are writing these answers, Johanna and I are available if you have any questions. Here's our email. And you feel free to call us if you are stumped on, 8 or 9 and like, I just don't know what to put. Just give us a call. We're happy to help. I've been writing semi-annual grant reports for at least 3 years now, so I do have some experience in trying to use some of the ways that we discussed in highlighting the work that we've done.
Yeah, I think all I have to add to what Mary's saying is, if you all have any questions, please feel free to ask. Please feel free to reach out to us. We want to make sure that all of the work that we know that you're doing is reflected in your grant reporting, because right now it isn't all being reflected in the grant reporting, and we want it to be in there. So however we can support that.
Thank you, everyone. We hope you have a good rest of your reporting period and new year, and reach out to us anytime you need to. Thank you.